This is episode 544 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing.
And I'm Wally Drangmeister.
I'm president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. Wally, the hits keep coming for us with these electric vehicles. The latest is the governor, through her construction industries division, again, another agency under the full control of the governor, it is looking at new regulations that would mandate EV charging stations be made available to the tune of 20% of all parking spots at new apartment complexes and new commercial real estate developments throughout the state of New Mexico. And there has already been, and justifiably so, a great deal of back and forth on this issue on the pages of the Albuquerque Journal editorial pages. An excellent editorial from the Albuquerque Journal talking more broadly about these EV mandates, including the construction industry division mandate that's proposed, as well as the head of the New Mexico Apartment Association had a article dealing with Alan Lasek is his name, dealing with the specifically apartment related aspect of this mandate. So we are getting the classic case of subsidies and mandates on top of subsidies and mandates for whatever our politicians want to foist on us.
Yeah, and in this case, this is not a subsidy. This is an unfunded mandate to do
Mm-hmm.
something that's going to add tremendously to the cost. And just in a city that's looking at how to create more housing, drive down the price of housing, attract business, so on and so forth, to put this in there is pretty striking. And we will see. I think this is a big enough one. Not going to comment on the likelihood of winning in a court of law, but the ability to use the regulatory process is not absolute. And so, is there a lawsuit in the future, and what will be the impact of that? Because this is a mighty big one. Now, keep in mind, they could have just as easily said, "Hey, here's a tax credit. Here's an incentive to do this for new ones." No, I'm just saying. But would that be a good idea? Maybe it would, maybe it wouldn't. But guess what? It has to go through the legislature as well. It's not just one of these things that is a rule created out of thin cloth with no tie back to the legislative process. And you know, guess what? We're betting a lot of money that the EV goals and plans are going to work out well, not only in New Mexico but across the country. And there's plenty of cracks in that theory, and so we might find ourselves with the about the time we get a bunch of charging stations, people are like, "Nope, I'm not buying these EVs. Let's go back to something that actually works well for us." So we'll have to see. But this issue evidently is not going away here in New Mexico.
Yeah, well, in true government fashion, this state under this governor has monomaniacally focused on getting EVs as the preferred or the required choice of New Mexicans in terms of driving. They are spending taxpayer dollars, primarily federal dollars, on EV charging stations themselves. They are mandating uh, or potentially, and we will notify folks when the actual proposal comes out because so far you cannot comment on something that has not been proposed yet. But once the Construction Industries Division, CID, promulgates that regulation, we will make sure to alert people and we will issue our own comments. But the expectation is that given each charging station costs upwards of $18,000. This is going to exacerbate the housing challenges that we face, both by just making them more expensive. So, say, Wally, you're a developer and you develop an apartment complex with, oh, say, 100 parking spots. Well, 20 of them have to be extra fancy and EV outfitted, EV charging station outfitted. Uh, so you're raising the cost, but on the flip side, there may be people who don't have as deep of pockets as you, Wally, and they don't uh, put those apartments in place at all. So it will diminish supply while increasing the price tag of the new apartment complexes themselves. And this is leading to mandates that will be implemented at some point in the not too distant future. If this succeeds, or this passes, not succeeds, but is put into place, then they will just start mandating it on existing developments. It's not
Yeah,
hard to see.
you gotta put it back in. It's like uh, let's put it this way: you have to remediate for asbestos in an old building, or else you can't use it. So yeah, it's not again. Don't give them ideas, but it's not hard to imagine that. And then, Paul, the other thing is if we look to the adoption of electric vehicles to this point in time, there's three things that I think, in all the studies I've read and the analysis is EVs are for the affluent, they're for the urban, very urbanized commuter, and they're very popular amongst people that are already whatever a two-car family and they add a third car.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that does not sound to me like the majority of New Mexico, much less Albuquerque. So let's just for a second, a thought experiment, take Albuquerque out of the equation. And does that define, the rest of the state? And the answer is no way. So very interesting that this is happening. And then I do think, and this is just another example, is who is the constituency of the government, whether it be our elected officials or in this case the governor and the administrative apparatus, and it certainly looks like it's the national environmental movement, not the
Mm-hmm.
citizens of New Mexico, is who this plays well to.
Yeah, it is just incredibly frustrating that voters could have easily seen, with the modicum of foresight, didn't have to be something that required the crystal ball to look at the governor and her past track record, to see forward into the future and see what she's done on guns, see what she's doing on EVs, and again, all of this being undertaken without the legislature and their input. Now, the legislature could, if they so desired, they could easily engage in this process and push back. If this were somehow a Republican legislature, I can bet that they would be much more aggressive in pushing back on the governor's overreach. But because it is a Democrat, and no matter how unpopular she may be with her fellow Democrats, they are just not able or willing to organize themselves to push back against it. And real quickly, while uh, the unfunded mandate aspect of this is certainly problematic, I don't see the idea of, we have all this oil and gas money, pumping those dollars into subsidies for EVs in apartment complexes and commercial real estates. I'm not a fan of that particular approach either. It's kind of like, uh, what's the best way to, fleece a sheep? You just kill it and take the wool, or do you
Right.
fleece it slowly and at the time take it that way? I mean, the smarter approach is to take the wool. That would be without killing the sheep. But I would much rather have that kind of battle on our hands and have that platform to fight against her on, rather than just being able to bribe everybody. And she can literally bribe pretty much any interest group in the state that she wants with the oil and gas money that we have available.
Well, yeah, and then Paul, as I was reading that, it's like I just think it's crazy. By the way, so then here's the thing: um, how we do. Let's just look at a distant yet maybe relevant analog, and that is that of handicap parking spaces. So that it's required lots of places, and guess what? There's one of two things. Generally, there are too many of them, and
Hmm.
many they are the only open parking spots in places. But sometimes there's not enough, and there's not any flexibility with regard to that. The other thing with regard to EV, it's one of those, again, not saying I'm advocating this, but just what about the idea about saying that, we encourage you to at least plan in future development of that. And I'm thinking, as guess what? Everything went wireless inside the house for the most part. So, but there once was a time where, when people were building a new home, they would put coax cable or twisted pair wire everywhere, because they're like, well, it only costs a few $100s to do that up front, and we don't know what's going to happen. And frankly, even in the wireless uh, environment we found themselves in, I know a lot of people who did that in their houses are glad they did, because they're able to do certain things. So, something about that, maybe, build the possibility in, or have a plan to where you could add it, and so that you could spend, literally a few dollars up front to save tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, if you ever wanted to add this. But to just add it up front all over the place. And again, maybe in Albuquerque, you might get some use on that, but you know what? So I'm building I'm building a fourplex in Clayton, New Mexico. I have to build, I have to have a NGV charging station to even do that. It just seems like this is not a really well thought through plan, and it will be interesting to see what happens with regard to pushback from various communities on this, and what the result of that is.
Yeah. Well, uh, capping this whole thing off, Trevor, the inimitable cartoonist for the Albuquerque Journal and the Sunday paper, has a family driving clearly down a New Mexico highway or byway. And one says to the other, if the state wants us to buy EVs, they need to build more charging stations. The other says, if the frequency of state highway rest areas is any guide, we're doomed. And interestingly enough, I mentioned the rest areas mostly from a quality perspective. Uh,
But from a number perspective too, you got to
yeah,
drive a long way, even on our interstates, if you drive through New Mexico to find a rest area. That's for sure.
yeah. A friend, by the way, snapped a picture of a drinking fountain at a rest area, unnamed, in New Mexico, that had a sign above the water fountain that said non-potable water. Uh, a bit of a vocabulary test there, Wally, because if you put no non-potable water on the back of a truck with water in it, that doesn't really test people's knowledge, because they're not going to be able to drink that water. It's whoever's carting it around knows what the term potable means. But if you put "don't drink this water" right above the
Exactly.
drinking fountain, anyway,
Yeah, people without a very good vocabulary and an eighth grade vocabulary are subjecting themselves to drinking bad water here in New Mexico. If that indeed is true.
yeah, hopefully they know the definition of potable. Uh, it was a big week for things happening in issue areas that the Rio Grande Foundation really has done a lot of work in, and obviously the EV thing is really the big issue currently that we are working on. We've had basically an informal segment every single week on the show for over a month uh, on EVs. Now, unfortunately, the film subsidies are an issue that the New Mexico taxpayers continue to be fleeced on, and out of like a bolt of lightning out of the blue, the Legislative Finance Committee did a report on film subsidies in New Mexico, and it's getting a little bit of traction. There was a segment on KOB radio that I was essentially, they used my audio for, just reading essentially what this report had to say. But the Legislative Finance Committee did a in-depth analysis of the New Mexico film subsidy program and had some fairly strong conclusions that we've only been talking about here on this show for about episode 1, not and before. But here I'll read from the executive summary. This is again the LFC speaking. Evidence suggests film incentives are less effective at attracting private investment, cost more per job, and have a lower return on investment than other incentive programs. Film subsidies cost more than twice as much per job as the other large economic development incentives. Most state evaluations and fine film incentives have a negative ROI, return on investment. For those who don't know what potable means, just kidding. In the next 5 years, film subsidies paid out could grow by 171%, increasing from $100 million to $272 million by FY 2028. Pretty damning.
Yes, it is pretty damning. And, those are the sorts of studies that in the past, those that are big supporter of the film credit, and there's a lot of people that are supporters of that, would say, oh, this is just some white right-wing wacko group that's just trying to, beat the film subsidies back because they don't like them for whatever reason. No, this was the Legislative Finance Committee. This is the group that analyzes policy for its impact in New Mexico. It's been around a long time, and it's one of those things. To the extent that it has legislative in front of it, they are serving the legislature, which is far more Democrat than it is Republican, and so I don't think that there can be any question, although I guess there could be, of this being somehow underhanded analysis that they're being presented with. They're just presenting the facts. But again, those facts have been out there for a long time, and other states have made different decisions than New Mexico with regard to film subsidies because of a lot of these studies that have been done.
Yeah, and there's a lot of useful information. Of course, I provided a link for this report on our website, errorsofenchantment.com. But there is we're not fans of economic development incentives as a general rule. So you're already comparing second best in terms of state subsidies for various economic actors in the form of corporate welfare with other forms of corporate welfare. Of course, what we should be doing is, Wally, got to put that bingo chip in the middle there, the free pass on gross receipts tax reform, reducing also the rate of the gross receipts tax, eliminating to the point of complete elimination the state's personal income tax. All of these things, given the revenue we have from oil and gas, are imminently possible. We, of course, need to also address crime and reform our education system. No more money needed on really either of those. I think you can do the crime situation if you have public officials in place that actually prioritize it. But here are economic development incentives. FY 2022, so a couple years ago, but film tax credit $60.1 million or $60.5, I should say. So by far and away the biggest. LEDA, Local Economic Development Act, LEDA is a acronym. This is one where they oftentimes cut checks to companies for setting up a factory or something like that. And so it's a one-time payment by and large, but we don't like anything that specifically, corporate welfare in general, but when you're cutting checks out of the Treasury, that's where we really have concern. And the film subsidy, LEDA also, $34 million. JTIP, Job Training Incentive Program. Now, some would say this would be called your education system. I know that's really crazy to expect that your graduates of high schools and universities be ready to take the jobs that are available in your economy when they get done. But Job training incentive program is $27 million. That one is, in the grand scheme of things,
Yeah.
it's not our favorite, not the worst. Statewide TIDS, I was impressed they stuck this one in here because this is something that just we dealt with in the last legislative session. There's a TID subsidy, tax increment development
Hmm.
district. Important to say that clearly, TID. Yeah, and 12 million bucks for that one. Actually, close to $13 million. We're not fans of that one either. Then you get into a lot of tax credits, high wage tax credit, investment credit, uh, $6 million each. About those get into diminishing to the point of harmlessness in terms of how much of a expenditure they are, or non-collection. Those are a tax expenditure by and large because they are true tax credits
Right.
that just mean that some revenue along the line that the state could have gotten, they didn't get. So uh, we'd prefer that to be done on a broad basis, available to all taxpayers. The state has the money to do that, but they don't have the inclination or incentive to, apparently, aside, because let's face it, I don't think the people running New Mexico really care about improving the state economy or developing the economy. So that is a rundown of, and a very interesting rundown, I might add, of the subsidy programs. And it's worth noting that the film subsidy program is really bigger. Not just well, let's see, it's about the size of LEDA and JTIP combined. So that's a significant amount of money. And by the way, FY 2022. So we're talking a few years ago. That program, by and large, has only grown. The film industry one, while the others are generally more constant. And they ebb and flow a little bit more, especially LEDA, because if you've got Maxion Solar, for example, coming to
Right.
town, they're going to cash out a ton of LEDA money. Anyway, it is nice to be uh, proven right once again on one of these issues. Being right is has its charm. Uh, Actually having your policies implemented or bad policies changed because you've been right all this time is much more satisfying, though,
Yeah,
unfortunately.
yeah, absolutely. And then the other thing is that I do believe this is a straightforward, well done analysis coming out of the LFC. It's interesting. Are there going to be topics that, well, in the future we just prefer that you not study this anymore because we know enough about this. So that would be my concern with something like this. And so, yeah, we're like 130 million dollars. Very focused, JTIP, because administratively it's so difficult to administer. And even the big companies, I hear horror stories frequently about how difficult it is to qualify for JTIP and actually get the money back. So as a result, it's not very useful for smaller businesses. It tends to be the big business thing. But, we have enough money here that you could actually create a better business environment with some reform of the gross receipts tax for to the tune of 120 130 $40 million in terms of reducing or eliminating the tax on business input services. Business to business is one of the things that makes businesses not want to come to New Mexico, and it makes a lot of venture financed and startup entities that actually get going in New Mexico because of technology, or people who are here want to move elsewhere during their growth phase because a startup business in general spends a lot of money on services. They don't have an employee for everything. And in New Mexico, those cost 7.5% roughly more than they do in surrounding states. So I know it's not the first time I've said this, but it is interesting, the things that in all likelihood would be most beneficial systemically for New Mexico diversifying its economy never get a whole lot of attention other than lip service. And you know what? It's not even getting that going into this 2024 legislative session. It seems like things are quiet as can be. And not saying that they haven't discussed this at somewhere along the line at a legislative interim committee, but believe me, I don't see people out there in the administration or in the legislature talking about their plans or their ideas for that coming up here in January of 2024.
Well, Democrats in the legislature, and of course they control things, have been explicitly focused on expanding the film subsidy program, especially under Lujan Grisham. Susana Martinez did try to reduce it somewhat. She mostly just placed that cap on it that then created a backlog of debt by the state, which is, again, a problem if your economic development programs are creating debts that need to be paid off in the future. Of course, it all worked out for Lujan Grisham because she had plenty of oil and gas money, and that's kind of another dog that doesn't bark. It's that money that in most states would be used to really reform and rip out bad tax policies and build your economy. In New Mexico, it's by and large being wasted relatively silently. All you're seeing is just more money being dumped into government programs. So, speaking of money that could be wasted and used for other things, and also things that I don't want to be proven right about, but expect that I will at some point, depending on what happens at City Council. The broad parameters of the United Stadium lease are out. The lease is not, to my knowledge, out yet, although it may have been introduced last night at City Council. What is going on here is that the soccer team and the city, the Keller administration specifically, have broad agreements that there's going to be a soccer stadium built in a corner of a parking lot over at Balloon Fiesta Park. The cost is going to be $30 million borne by the team, with $13.5 million in state capital outlay money being available from pass through from the state, from the oil and gas industry to the soccer stadium. That's a better deal than the $50 million that taxpayers voted down. But here's the part where, Wally, this is not higher math, this is simple math, but dear listener and Wally, stick with me for just a second.
Okay.
All right, so that was in November of 2021. So 2 years ago, we're talking about. In March of this year, the LFC, our good friends over there, said that construction costs in New Mexico had just about doubled. All right, so when that $50 million was on the ballot, the Albuquerque chamber, which was supporting that vote, they wanted to see that bond passed. We opposed it, and we were right yet again. They wanted to, the ultimate plan was $50 million on the backs of the taxpayers, and the stadium costing $65 to $70 million. Now, they were looking at locations that were much more urban in the downtown area, maybe not the property owned by the city per se. I don't know, because we never found out specifically where they were going to build, but we're talking a facility up to $70 million before housing prices, or before construction costs, doubled. Now we are looking at a $30 million from the team plus $13.5 million, so a $43.5 million stadium at Balloon Fiesta Park, built on city-owned land. So yes, it's basically owned by the taxpayers, owned by the city. So there's little to no cost there. But remember, construction prices have gone up dramatically, and anybody in the industry, we had Carla Kugler, she was saying the same thing. Are we building a bare bones stadium that then the team will come back and say, we want more, goodies, bells and whistles on this thing? and who's going to pay for that? Or are we going to just see massive cost overruns, and then who's going to pay for that? So when city council sits down and talks about this, my firm belief is that we need to sort out who is going to be responsible for cost overruns and future expenses. I have not seen that spelled out. Granted, I have not seen the contract itself, just the reporting on the contract. So need to take a close look at that. But
Yes, and so Paul, I will offer another alternative
ooh, I like it.
in addition to your two. And is it that here's the thing: if you're spending other people's money, you'll do things for their way. And believe me, for whatever reason, people there's a constituency in city government that's very positive to put things downtown.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like, hey, we if let's put the soccer stadium downtown. We'll get you the money to do that in the forms of bonds. We know it's going to cost a lot more, but hey, it's free money. Fine, we'll go for it. That gets voted down. They're like, okay, that doesn't work good. But now that we're going to have skin in the game, we have to put up the money on the private sector, at least significant amounts. Heaven forbid, did they maybe go and look at a place that cost less, that made more sense financially, because it didn't have the overwhelming portion of it being paid with OPM, other people's money, or in this case, other people's taxes. So maybe that's the case. But your point is also a good one when it comes to government programs of almost any kind, whether they be one offs like this or big ones. There is a long history of the revenues that are purported to come from these projects being lower than estimated and the costs being higher. So your point is well taken. What are those? Who's responsible for them? Because is there a backhanded way to say, oh yeah, we're gonna the taxpayers would absorb all cost overruns? You might as well just give them the money right now because they're going to be there.
Yeah, and again, I'm not completely against the idea of a stadium, even at Balloon Fiesta Park. I'm going to trust that this is less problematic uh, as a site, and that this is going to have a neutral to positive impact on Balloon Fiesta, because I would expect that the folks who were going to be convening here this weekend for the Balloon Fiesta would be squealing very loudly if this was going to be an issue. I've heard uh, some discussion out of them, but I haven't heard a lot of, hey, this thing is going to really have a negative impact here. So it's not that I'm completely opposed to a new stadium. It just, before get into these kinds of long-term agreements, 30 years specifically, at the outset, you need to have those kind of things clearly analyzed and made abundantly clear in the contract. And there's going to be maintenance issues and those kinds of things that come up that also need to be addressed. So we will be working to find more details on this, but I encourage folks out there to drop their counselor a line and say, hey, what is the deal here? What are we going to be on the hook for as residents of the city of Albuquerque?
Yeah, and then Paul, the other thing is that that is the Balloon Fiesta Park. There's no question it's underutilized most of the year. It's during the Balloon Fiesta, it's absolutely utilized. But yeah, what's the relationship between this stadium and Balloon Fiesta? It could be a good thing. I was just envisioning. Could you have concerts, outdoor concerts at this stadium associated with the Bloom Fiesta after the fireworks show or something? Maybe you could, maybe you couldn't. But so a lot more information needs to be put forward on what this deal is fiscally and practically. But yeah, it is, I guess, at least initially, you would have to think that as strong as the Bloom Fiesta is, if this project is going to damage the Bloom Fiesta. If we haven't heard it already, that's a good sign, and I'm sure that constituency will take a really good hard look at this proposal.
I truly think that that this should be done in some conjunction with the New Mexico Lobos football stadium. That facility has all the parking in the world. It's where we've always gone for these kinds of events. As a city, there are basically less than 10 dates a year when that facility is really used for football games, including the New Mexico Bowl. You could do something as simple as change it back to grass, traditional grass, because I do know that the United League wants a grass field. That's if you talk to football players and just Google it,
They want grass
yeah,
too, big time. They do
NFL
not.
players
Yeah,
definitely are more
yeah.
inclined to the grass field. So that would be superior for everybody involved. And you could do some renovations to the stands and make that a more hospitable place to go watch a game of soccer or of football. But uh, again, in a time and in a place of plenty, and UNM has always been able to get in thick times and thin whatever they want, basically out of the legislature and the governing structure of New Mexico. There is no incentive in the system for them to work out some kind of sharing agreement there at the Lobo football stadium. So just to be clear, while Balloon Fiesta Park, if it's paid for by the team itself, I don't like the $13.5 million in capital outlay coming in from the state. It's this governor bribing, a business bribing the city to put this back into the process. Not that Keller didn't have plenty of incentives to do it, but $13.5 million basically takes the city out of any need to put up their own dollars. So we shall see where this all goes, but that's the idea. Got to keep those cost overruns under wraps.
All right.
Well, we will leave things there. Thanks for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at tippingpointsnm.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube channel. Subscribe to the show at Apple, Stitcher, or tell Google Home to play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.